Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Alexis. I am Kelly Marinden with Children's Health, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about some qualities of healthy relationships and kind of how to encourage these qualities in relationships for your teenagers. So just a little bit about me. I am a licensed professional counselor, and my role at Children's Health as a behavioral health care manager within the integrated behavioral health program. I've been with Children's Health for about 10 years. For 8.5 years, I was in the Center for Pediatric Eating Disorders, and the last 1.5 years, I've been in the integrated behavioral health department. Within that integrated behavioral health department, as Alexis mentioned, I work with the TCHAP program that offers some telebehavioral health support to students while they're in school and also helps family connect to community mental health services as needed. So I do serve some Prosper ISD campuses, and Vanessa Simpson is one of my colleagues that serves some of the other campuses. So it kind of depends on where your student goes. If you have any questions, please contact your counselor about that. So I'll go ahead and get started. So really, I'm going to talk to you guys about some big qualities of a healthy relationship and kind of how healthy relationships are built, and especially how this relates to teenagers. The top 3 components being trust, vulnerability, and connection. And then at the end, I'll kind of wrap it up with some ways to help you guys as parents know how to encourage these things within your teenagers. So we're going to start with trust. And one thing with trust that a lot of teens, I think, or at least that I see in my sessions, is really working on what the components of trust are, what it means, what trust means, the kind of anatomy of trust, as well as building trust. I hear a lot from students that I see that sometimes they have this association with time equaling trust. And so helping them remember that it's more than just the length of a relationship. There's a lot of things that go into building trust with somebody. And just because trust has been there in the past doesn't mean trust stays forever. And so just all the different components to trust, just some education I find a lot helpful for teens in when talking about trust, that there's a lot of things that go in and out of that. So when talking about trust, I'm going to use this acronym BRAVING that was created by Brene Brown. And Brene Brown is a clinical social worker, a professor, and a public speaker. She's done a lot of research on relationships, particularly on relationships, kind of how you view yourself. And has done a lot of research on shame, vulnerability, courage, and empathy. She has a ton of TED Talks and books and even a Netflix special. So if you're interested in this, I highly encourage you to check her out because she has a lot of great information. But I particularly love this acronym BRAVING, and she describes this as the anatomy of trust and how trust is built. So BRAVING stands for boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And we'll go through each one of these briefly to kind of discuss a little bit more what that means and what that means in terms of relationships, both with other people and with yourself. So we'll start with boundaries. And we're going to talk both about setting boundaries and also respecting other people's boundaries. I think with every aspect of trust, we have to look at both sides, both how people are treating us and how we're treating other people. So Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend are 2 psychologists who have done a lot of research in the field of boundaries, and they describe a boundary as a personal property line that marks those things for which we are responsible and that defines who we are and who we are not. And so when we think of a boundary in terms of a property line, when we're thinking of like an actual fence or something like that, if you look at this graphic at the bottom, if you're able to see the slideshow, looking at the one on the far right, the rigid wall. So if we're thinking about a property that has a wall up, it's going to be really hard for anything to get in or out of that property. And so just like with personal boundaries, a wall might be up because maybe someone's been hurt in the past and they've decided that they don't want to risk being hurt again. And so the problem with that wall being up is the result is that they're unable to have any real connection to somebody else because there's nothing allowed in and there's nothing allowed out. And it's really hard to receive support from other people. So that's a really rigid wall that they have up that they're just not able to experience connection with other people. The kind of opposite end of the spectrum on that would be these kind of limited or non-existent boundaries. So thinking of like a house that has no fence or barrier, that house or property has little control over who or what enters the property. And so how this pertains to personal boundaries is this might be someone who is afraid of being cut off, afraid of being abandoned by somebody. And so they're willing to let anybody and everybody in because they're afraid of what would happen if they set a boundary and they lost somebody. Unfortunately, this also leads to kind of being trampled as people walk in and out, and they have little control over how they're treated by other people. So the most healthy option is to have a fence, kind of a regular fence that you see on an everyday house that, and not like the rigid wall that would be impossible to knock down, but it is a healthy boundary. It keeps things in and out that has a gate. And so we all need that gate portion on our boundaries because that gives us the ability to let things in and out as we see fit, and gives us control over those things. So I always like to think of boundaries in that way, of that there's a huge spectrum of them, and making sure that you have a gate to let things in and out. So another important aspect of boundaries is that we help teens learn that they can connect with somebody while remaining separate and individual. And I think sometimes that can be hard, especially as they're starting at this age to have more romantic relationships and things like that. Sometimes boundaries get pushed a little bit more. Sometimes they become overly kind of enmeshed with another person, and helping them remember that they're still an individual. They still have hobbies, they still have responsibilities, they still have things that make them unique, and to help them set those boundaries with whoever the other person in their relationship is, that they are still able to be an individual. And sometimes just simply pointing this out to teens is enough. And I'll go over more at the end of the presentation about what to do when you've tried pointing things out and you feel like your teen is really struggling with being able to set those boundaries, because that's definitely something that happens. But it is a little bit normal for teens to have some enmeshment at this age while they're trying to figure out what a healthy relationship looks like. And so a lot of reflection in your teen and saying like, hey, you used to really enjoy doing this or doing that, or you used to spend time with this person, can sometimes help them reset those boundaries if they've let some of them go. It's also important to help teens realize that if they do set a boundary that is not respected by someone, it's not a reflection of the person setting the boundary, but of the other person who's not respecting the boundary. And sometimes that can get really confusing. I see a lot of teens sometimes having a hard time setting boundaries because they're afraid of upsetting somebody. And so that's where I talk a lot to teens about thinking about what they are in control of and what they are not in control of. And so looking at this graphic on this slide, nobody is in control of anybody else's emotions or behaviors. We are only in control of our own behaviors and actions and words. And so while our actions and words might influence the way someone feels, we are not responsible for them. And so it's helpful to be mindful about what we're doing and saying, but we don't have to take responsibility for someone's reaction to it, especially when it comes to setting boundaries with somebody. And I know that again is something that's really hard, and I see a lot of teens like that's a hard thing to feel like you've upset somebody, but reminding them that they have to take care of themselves first in these relationships. I think that's one thing that a lot of healthy relationship aspects come down to, is taking care of yourself first and being mindful about what's going on within yourself in order to have a healthy relationship with somebody else. I also want to talk about kind of, while not responsible for others' emotions, also not being responsible for someone else's safety. So this is another thing I see a lot with teens is a peer might be really struggling with self-harm or suicidal thoughts, and sometimes they rely on a friend to get them through those thoughts, and helping our teens realize that that is not their responsibility to stay up all night on the phone with somebody to keep them safe. And if someone is going through that, that needs to be escalated to an adult that is more capable of taking care of them. Again, I think that's something a lot of times when I talk to teens, they're uncomfortable with having to be that person in someone's life, but they don't know how to set the boundary to let them know that they can't be that person, or give themselves permission to not be that person, because that's a lot for anyone to carry, especially a teenager. I also just want to make note that one way that I kind of let teens know a good indicator if your boundaries being pushed is if an interaction feels inappropriate or uncomfortable. If there's any part of you that's saying kind of like, oh, I'm not really sure about this, or I really don't like doing this, but I don't want to make you upset, that's a good indicator that your boundary might be being pushed, and it's okay to say no. So again, just giving your teenagers permission to say no if something's making them uncomfortable, and hopefully coming to you when something's uncomfortable so that they can have a conversation about it and figure out what to do instead of just continuing to carry it on. As we go through the rest of the slides, you'll see a lot of these concepts do overlap a lot, especially with boundaries, because a lot of it comes down to being able to set boundaries with people, which is a really hard thing to do, but there is a lot of overlap between them. So the next letter in our braving acronym is R, which stands for reliability. So I think we all know what reliability means. You do what you say you're going to do, but there's also this component of not overpromising, able to deliver on your commitments while also respecting your ability to do that, so not putting too much on your plate. Again, this kind of goes back to boundaries. Really making sure that if you say you're going to do something, you are actually capable of doing it. Again, I think sometimes we have people pleasers that want to just do everything and all the things and really help as much as they can, but it comes at a cost. And then sometimes they're not able to do things because they've overextended themselves. And so I always try to reframe to students when they're feeling the pressure to commit to all these different things. By putting yourself in that situation, it ends up making you unreliable because either you've worn yourself down or you're now not able to keep up with your grades, your responsibilities, things like that. And so you actually become more reliable by saying no to some things and by being clear about what you can and cannot accomplish. And just giving them, again, that permission to set those boundaries and to let people know that's not something that I'm able to do right now. Communication and consistency is a big one with reliability. So communicating to people, I can't do that right now, but maybe in a couple of months I might be able to help you with it. Or, I know I committed to this and it's a month out and I just don't know if I'm going to be able to do it. But making sure that that communication is clear and that there's consistency with that. It's also really important to be reliable to yourself. And the more reliable, by that I mean being honest with yourself about what you can and cannot accomplish. And the more reliable you are and honest with yourself with that, the more reliable you can be for someone else. So the next letter is A for accountability. So this is owning your mistakes, apologizing and making amends when necessary, and sometimes changing behavior if needed. So it's kind of acknowledging the effects of your own behaviors and how they contribute to a cycle that's ongoing in a relationship. It's also, while we want to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable, I also see the opposite end of the spectrum where sometimes kids really struggle with taking all the accountability in a relationship. And so helping them realize that it's not, yes, it's important for you to take responsibility for your own behaviors and actions, those things that you do have control over, but you also can't minimize or excuse someone else's behavior because you want to take on everything. And so reminding them that it does go both ways. For a healthy relationship, you have to take accountability and the other person in the relationship has to take accountability for their own actions. This can be, you can hold someone else accountable in a really kind way. Sometimes students are really afraid to do this or afraid that they're going to come across as being mean or hurt somebody's feelings. And you can hold someone accountable while being kind and using assertive communication. It's going back to just setting that boundary and letting them know, hey, this happened and I really, it made me feel this way and I would appreciate it if this didn't happen anymore. So just reminding them that it's important on both sides with accountability. One way as parents that you guys can help with this accountability piece is modeling, because we all have moments when we're not at our best or we maybe say something and lash out or react in a way that we wish we didn't. And so by apologizing and making amends and acknowledging your own behavior with your partner at home, with other kids in the home, with your teenager, those are all great ways to help them realize that it's okay to take accountability when we mess up, because everybody does in relationships. It's just part of it. No, none of us are perfect. So just that's one way as parents you guys can help with that accountability piece. So the next letter is V for vault. So this is essentially kind of confidentiality. So we don't want to share information that's not ours to share. And we want to let our teens know that too. Like gossiping about other people isn't a helpful thing. And I also, when I like to reframe that if someone is gossiping to you a lot about other people, really thinking about what that means for what you're telling this person. And sometimes that aspect is often forgotten, that if someone's telling you a lot of everyone else's business, that might be a sign that they're not keeping your business confidential. So it goes both ways. You want to make sure that kids are being mindful about what's being shared with them and what they're sharing with other people, as well as what their friends are sharing with them, and being mindful that, hey, this person tells me about everybody else's business, so am I sure that they're not talking about what things that I am telling them? Just kind of a way to be mindful about that trust. So the next letter is I for integrity. So again, this is kind of, I think of integrity as kind of the reliability to yourself. So it's doing what you say you're going to do again, but choosing that courage over comfort, practicing your values instead of just professing them. So it's really more about who you are as a person, and really focusing on, is what I'm saying to myself or what I'm saying is important to me? Are my actions backing those words up? So it's very similar to reliability. It's similar to accountability, in that we take accountability, that we're staying true to ourselves and not giving into peer pressure and standing up for others. So just really making sure that we're choosing those values. We know students are able to identify what their values are, which sometimes you have to have a conversation with them about what are the things you value. Especially as teenagers, they're kind of starting to figure out what their own personal values are. So helping them solidify, like, what do you find important? What is something you value? And how are you living to practice those values instead of just saying it? Because this is a confusing time. They're figuring out a lot of things. They're figuring out a lot of those values. And so one way to help them have integrity is by having conversations about what they value and what they're doing to show that. Non-judgment is the next letter. So this is, I can ask for what I need and not worry about judgment. And oftentimes I hear from students, and I think most people in general, we kind of make assumptions about how we feel someone else is going to respond to something we say, and reminding ourselves that that in and of itself is actually placing judgment. So trying to remove the judgment of how we think someone is going to respond when we do ask for help. And then also reframing for our students, if you're worried, if you ask for help on this certain thing, or you tell somebody that you're feeling really sad or angry, and that person is judgmental, what does that mean for your relationship? If this person reacts in the way that you're afraid they are, then maybe they're not a healthy person to be in a relationship with. And so reminding them that even if it's that fear does come true, there's a bigger picture there to look at. So that's kind of what non-judgmental goes with. And then the last letter of braving is generosity. So this is extending the most generous interpretation of the intentions, words, and actions of others. So this is really important because again, we make a lot of assumptions of what we think people are trying to communicate. And it's really important that we don't jump to the most negative conclusion, which I think is a common thing we often do, especially now that a lot of communication happens digitally and through text messaging and things like that. And remembering that tone is not something that we can read through text. And oftentimes I see that things are blown out of proportion or taken a different way because we put a certain tone to it. And so by extending the most generous interpretation, we can ask clarifying questions. We can let the other person know, hey, this is what I interpreted when you said this. Can you clarify if that's what you meant? Or maybe there's something else. And so allowing that person the opportunity to explain themselves more, and just extending that generosity in that way. So that is the braving acronym and kind of the core anatomy of trust and the things that have to be there in order for trust to be built. And as you can tell, a lot of them overlap in a lot of different ways. And it's really important to take a look at not only how people are treating us, but how we're treating other people, and internally how we're handling a situation. Also really important to be mindful of, if these things aren't happening from another person, as I said, I think with one of the beginning with boundaries, if somebody isn't respecting these things, we're doing all these things, but if it's not being reciprocated, that isn't necessarily a reflection of you, but maybe that person isn't a healthy person to be in a relationship with or isn't ready to be in this kind of relationship. So it goes both ways. All healthy relationships really start with that relationship to yourself and how you're treating yourself in these relationships. So next we're going to talk about vulnerability. So kind of the dictionary definition of vulnerability is a quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being harmed. And again, I'm going to bring Brene Brown in because she just has a wonderful definition of it. And she describes vulnerability as the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And vulnerability is not weakness, but our most accurate measure of courage. And this is something that I talk with students a lot about, is how when they're afraid of being vulnerable with someone, and almost everybody I talk to associates vulnerability with weakness. And so we talk about, if vulnerability is weakness, then what makes vulnerability so hard to do? If that's being weak, why is it such a hard thing? And then normally they kind of think about it more and they're like, that's true. It is really hard to be vulnerable. It actually is really scary to be vulnerable because it's something that takes a lot of courage. And so reminding them that by being courageous and being vulnerable, that's something that can help them come to a better connection with somebody else. This quote actually goes on to say, when the barrier is our belief about vulnerability, the question becomes, are we willing to show up and be seen when we can't control the outcome? And I think at the core, that's being vulnerable, is knowing that we are taking a risk and that we are still showing up even when we know that we could be hurt in the end. And that really illustrates the courage that it does take to be vulnerable, and that being vulnerable is not a weakness. Every relationship takes some kind of risk in order to grow. And without that risk, we don't experience the true connection to someone else. So it kind of goes back to those boundaries I talked about at the beginning. If someone has this really rigid wall up, it's going to be really hard for them to ever be vulnerable with anybody, which then is going to make it really hard for them to ever experience true connection to anybody. Vulnerability really starts within oneself and the willingness to acknowledge and express emotions, especially emotions that are painful or difficult. So sometimes we want to pretend like everything's fine, even to ourselves. We don't allow ourselves to feel those difficult emotions. And that is where it's going to stay. We're not going to be able to connect or be vulnerable with anybody else until we're able to express to ourselves and be honest with ourselves about what's going on. So again, this starts with us and the relationship with ourselves and then moves outwards. Some of the benefits of emotional vulnerability is it really strengthens relationships. So you have to have trust first, and once you have trust, then you can be more vulnerable with someone. And as you're more vulnerable with someone, it increases the amount of trust you have. So they kind of work hand in hand to build on each other, and it also builds intimacy with another person. When we take a risk and it pays off, that relationship is able to grow more deeply and be more meaningful. Without taking the risk or being vulnerable, there's always a sense that part of you is not being seen. And that's what hinders us from having true connection, is feeling like this person doesn't know the true me. And it takes being vulnerable to be able to show that. Vulnerability also improves self-awareness, helps us learn about ourselves and our defense mechanisms that we might engage in. So again, healthy relationship starts with the relationship with yourself. So how to be emotionally vulnerable is to acknowledge and observe and validate your feelings, being able to admit to yourself how you're feeling. When you're dismissive of your own emotions, it sometimes means we never fully connect with anybody else. It's keeping yourself from being vulnerable and keeping yourself from connection. And then communicating. So I always talk to students about, when we're trying to be vulnerable, when we're starting out trying to be vulnerable, it's a really scary and hard thing to do. So start small, start basic. Start with a really basic I feel statement. I feel mad, I feel sad, I feel happy, I feel nervous, and just leave it there. You don't have to have an explanation. Sometimes simply just starting to let somebody know how you feel is enough to get the ball rolling. And as parents, you can help with this by, if your student comes to you and says something like, I feel a certain way, validate that they're feeling that way instead of trying to make them have an explanation for why they're feeling that way. Sometimes that's either too scary for them to be able to communicate, or they don't really know why they feel that way. And so the more as parents we can validate, okay, you feel sad, then they're going to get more and more confident and comfortable with sharing those communications, with sharing those emotions, and being able to be vulnerable in different ways. So now we'll move on to connection. So we all crave and strive for connection. We are biologically wired that we want to feel seen and heard and understood by someone else. And being able to feel seen and understood by someone else is something that does not happen without vulnerability. So again, these things really build on each other. You have to have trust in order to be vulnerable, and you have to be vulnerable in order to have a true connection. There is a lot of kind of replacement connection or ways that we feel connected with people, but it's not a true connection, and sometimes that can get confusing with teens. Technology is one way that, while technology is a great way to kind of maintain some form of connection with people at times, and sometimes people start developing that connection through technology, there's still something lacking than there is in a face-to-face connection. So I know all of our teens are much more comfortable communicating through technology, but reminding them that that face-to-face interaction is still really important. Sometimes what happens with the technology is it can be easier to loosen your boundaries through technology. You might be more vulnerable than you were really ready to be if you were face to face. And then there's this fear of, when you have to see that person face to face, can you maintain the amount of vulnerability you had over the technology, over text message, over with the screen between you. So just kind of encouraging that even though you're using technology, maintaining the same level of boundaries that you have in person. There's also can be this tendency to not be completely genuine through technology, or trying to more show the highlight reel, so to speak. And so then when you do have to show up and be that face-to-face version of yourself, there's this feeling of being incongruent with who you've portrayed over technology to who that real authentic self is. And so what that leads to is, again, not feeling truly seen because you've kind of been inauthentic in some ways. Again, not necessarily on purpose. I think sometimes that just happens over technology. We tend to let boundaries go. We tend to be more vulnerable, and we tend to maybe not want to show all of the nitty gritty bad things. We only show the good things. And so being mindful and reminding our teens that authenticity and being genuine to who we are is the only way to experience that true connection to someone else. There can be a tendency, not even through technology, but just in general, for students to feel like they need to sacrifice other things like their boundaries in an attempt to gain a connection with a certain person, whether they feel like they put this person on a pedestal for whatever reason. Sometimes we do see that teens start doing that, and that is definitely a concern as a parent. You see your kid doing things that you didn't think they'd ever do in the name of trying to connect with somebody else. And that's where you can go back to reminding them that that is not true connection, because you're not being your authentic self. That person will never see you for you, and there will always feel like there's something lacking there. And so that true connection only comes when you're holding true to your boundaries that actually mean something to you. So this is all great information, but how do you help your teen with this? How do you encourage these healthy relationships in your teen? So one of the biggest and best ways to help teens is the relationships they see at home, they are going to try and replicate whether they're healthy or not. So being really mindful about the kinds of relationships that you're modeling, both with your people around you at home, with your teenager at home, everybody you interact with. And no one has a perfect relationship. No one is perfect at relationships, no matter what. There's always things that could be different, but one of the most important aspects is that when we're not perfect, when we do mess up and do or say something we wish we didn't have, is that we're making an attempt to repair the relationship. That is way more important than having the quote unquote perfect relationship, because that doesn't exist. And so the more we're able to show that we're all human, we all make mistakes, but we can make amends, we can apologize, and we can repair and move on. That's what makes a strong and healthy relationship, is those efforts of repairment. as teens become closer to adults, it's also really important to make adjustment to your relationship with those teens because they're moving more towards independence. And so as parents, that can be really hard of, for so long you've been in control of everything, and now they're in this place where they're kind of wanting to take back more control, and you might see some things that you're concerned about in their relationships. And so it's really hard to find the balance of, when do I step in and say something, and when do I let them figure it out on their own? And so some ways to do that, to increase that trust and autonomy and to help build their self-esteem and self-confidence, it's helping them or allowing them to make decisions when it's appropriate and asking for their input in decisions, allowing them to make mistakes in friendships as long as they're safe. And especially when it comes to, if they're spending way too much time with somebody and you're concerned about, they're not making the grades that they used to be making, or they're not showing up to work on time, or there's other things that are happening because they're way too involved in another relationship, focusing on the consequences of them choosing to spend too much time in that relationship. So focusing on, hey, your grades aren't where they need to be. We need to, there are consequences for your grades not being what they're supposed to be. So instead of, you're spending too much time with this person, help them realize that when they can realize on their own that it's because they're spending too much time with someone, that's going to make a much bigger difference than you as a parent constantly being on them, if that makes sense. So trying to really focus on, by them choosing to spend too much time with someone, these are the actions that are happening, and there are consequences to those actions. So trying to provide guidance, but not making all the decisions for them when possible, trying to find that middle ground, and that really helps build their self-image and maintain a positive relationship with you as their parent. Communication is huge. So getting to know their friends, asking about their friends, just kind of being curious about their relationships. If you're seeing something that you're concerned about, the more you can present with curiosity of, hey, I noticed this person said that to you. How did that make you feel when someone said that to you? Instead of saying, I don't like the way that person talks to you, because that's going to make them defensive. Be more curious about it. Ask them to give feedback. Let them know if there's patterns you're seeing that you're concerned about. It's okay to let them know that. But again, unless it's a safety concern, they're going to make mistakes in relationships, and those mistakes are how they're going to learn to grow. And if we're constantly there rescuing them from making those mistakes, then they're not going to figure that out as adults. So in some ways it's super hard to do as a parent, because we don't want to see our kids hurt or in a relationship that we're concerned about. So be curious, let them know patterns you're seeing, let them know you're there for them, letting them know you're there to talk if they're concerned about things. Now, obviously, if it is a safety concern, if a situation is unsafe, if you're concerned about abuse or the other person or your student being, having self-harm thoughts or suicidal thoughts, that's definitely a time for you to step in. And that's the time for you to set boundaries. And that shows that you respect and trust their ability to handle tough situations, but you're also going to take care of them when they need to be taken care of. You are still the adult, you are still the parent, and when something isn't safe anymore, you're going to do something about it. So this kind of leads to boundary setting, right? So we all students, even though sometimes they don't want to admit it, we all need boundaries set in some ways. It helps us feel safe when we know that there's boundaries. And so letting your teen know that, again, if you're not making good decisions because you're spending so much time with this person, we're going to focus on the fact that you're not making good decisions, and there will be consequences for those. If you're putting yourself at risk or at danger, then we're going to step in and set some more boundaries than were there before. And that is definitely okay to do. Safety is the most important thing. And then therapy is always really helpful and important. Even if you don't feel like your teen is struggling with like depression or anxiety, but you're just noticing some unhealthy patterns in relationships. Therapy is a great way to allow your teen a place to have some self-reflection in what is going on in these relationships and why they keep getting themselves in these patterns of relationships that might not be healthy. Sometimes there's lots of different reasons why teens get stuck in these. Sometimes they feel, again, there's that people pleasing mode of they don't want to hurt someone else's feelings. And so they do whatever they can to make that person feel good and at the expense of themselves. And so reminding them that they are important and that they have to take care of themselves first in order to have healthy relationships with other people. So I know, I don't know, there have been some questions. So I think I answered most of what I saw within the presentation, but any other questions that have come up or any that I didn't answer? Let me stop sharing.
And if anybody wants to put any questions in the chat, then we'll make sure we ask them for Kelly to answer. I know the only question that I've seen so far is if we'll be sharing this, and yes, we are recording it and we'll be posting it on our website. And I put the link of where it'll be posted on there, or if you can't find it, you can always reach out to your campus counselor and they can direct you to where it'll be found. I guess we'll wait like a couple more minutes to see if anybody has any questions for you. But I do want to thank you for presenting tonight and thank everybody who joined us. If you have any questions about the presentation or counseling resources, then you're welcome to reach out to your child's counselor and they can direct you to the presentation or information or resources that you might need. And then just as a reminder that all of our students have access to telebehavioral counseling sessions through Children's Health. So if you have questions or want more information about telebehavioral counseling, then you can reach out to your child's counselor and they can get you that information. We do work with 2 different therapists depending on your child's school for counseling services. And I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to that, to telebehavioral, while we have a couple minutes, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. So the services that I provide through TChat, it is short term, it is 4 sessions. So it is really focusing on developing coping skills and providing psychoeducation to students, some of which what I just talked about, I end up talking a lot about. This is definitely a common theme that I talk to students about is these aspects of healthy relationships. So just providing that education and then helping families connect to community resources if longer term therapy is needed or a different type of therapy is needed, helping you as parents navigate the system. I know it can be really confusing to know what you're even looking for when starting out with therapy. And so that's part of my job is helping parents navigate the system, helping connect you with who is going to best support your child for whatever it is that they're going through on top of those sessions if that's warranted.
Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and go through some of the questions that were brought up. It says, how do I connect when they are trying not to connect or share?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it comes down to they obviously they have to be the ones to they have to feel comfortable connecting, but letting them know that you're there for them and using a lot of validation. And using a lot of reflection of I see that you're really sad and I want to help you through this, and in trying not to ask too much for explanations. I think as parents, understandably, we want to fix whatever it is that's going on for our child that might be making them upset, but sometimes that leads to them not wanting to share because they're afraid that because you're trying to fix it, they feel like they're doing something wrong. And so coming from a place more of validation and understanding of, I can tell that this is really hard for you. And then if you want to offer some kind of advice, ask their permission for it of, there's some things that I think might be helpful. Is it okay if I share that with you? But at the end of the day, just really trying to validate and be there for them. And it is hard because they do have to be willing to share those things. And if they're not, then maybe they're not. And just keep coming back to it. Keep letting them know that you're seeing something, you're noticing something, and you're there for them if they want to talk. Keep giving them that opportunity because the more you give that, eventually they'll probably say, okay, mom knows something's going on. My parents know me a little bit better than I think they do, and they are a safe person to talk to.
And then the next question that came up was, when do they know that therapy is needed? So when would a parent know that their child is needing some additional help?
That's a great question, and definitely not a black and white question. There's kind of lots of different ways to answer that. I'd say anytime you're concerned about behavior changes that you're noticing in your student, whether that's, grades are slipping or they're spending a lot more time isolating, or you're trying to talk to them and they're just not reciprocating, even though you can tell something's going on. Anything like that is a great time to kind of reach out for some additional assistance. I also think just as parents, if you have that inclination that maybe they're not in a healthy relationship or you're really worried about a relationship they're in, it's okay to seek out therapy at that time. There's lots of different reasons, but really anytime as parents you're worried about behavior changes or you're noticing that they are not acting the same way that they used to is a good time to reach out. Because even, therapy's never, there's always something that can be talked about in therapy, even for people who aren't struggling, like I said, with diagnosable anxiety and depression. Therapy is still helpful. We also go through things that we need something to process through. So there's never a wrong time to seek out therapy.
Another question was, are these topics taught to students at school? So healthy relationships is a topic that's addressed at school for different age appropriate levels. And so if you have questions, the counselor should be sending out information. It is typically put out in the principal's weekly newsletter. So you should be able to see what topics that are coming up that your child will hear. If you want information, you can reach out to your counselor to get more details. I know just this week I was watching a class where they were talking about healthy relationships, and they were had discussions, and then there was I guess, assimilation where there was pepper, sugar, and soap, and the pepper represents the people and all the things that we do. And when you put soap, which then they talked about bad choices, then people move away from the soap because you don't want to be around people that are saying negative things, making bad choices. And then when you add sugar, it draws the pepper back into the soap. So that's when you're making good choices and doing kind things for others. So they are age appropriate lessons. That was an elementary lesson that was done. So it's age appropriate. They are talking about healthy relationships. But if you want more information about that, counselors do post their lessons, or not post, but let you know what are going to be talked about in the weekly principal newsletters when they're coming up. Or you can just always reach out to the counselor anytime to get more information. Another question that came out was, will Kelly's contact information be provided in the presentation? And I know that you had an introduction of yourself on the first slide, but I don't know, was your email or contact information on that?
It is not, but I can send that to you, Alexis. You're free to share that if you want, or the school counselors. Most of them, at least the schools I work with, have it. So definitely happy to have that shared.
So we can get that information to you. The next is, will there be presentation for older elementary kids and those starting middle school with issues that may be going through? So I guess that question would be, is in terms of relationships, and I guess, is there some differences really on how an older elementary or middle school student would handle the relationship issues that you talked about?
Yeah, great question. I think trust, vulnerability, and connection is true for everybody in every type of relationship. Definitely can spend more time making the language more appropriate, but always bringing it back to how someone makes you feel when you're talking, even in older elementary, middle school. Like, is this person making you feel uncomfortable? How do you feel about the way this person's treating you? Those are always great questions, no matter what the age, to help that student start reflecting on how they're being treated and if they like it or not. And that's really what a healthy relationship comes down to, is really taking time to do that internal check-in with themselves as to if they're okay and comfortable with where this relationship is. And if they don't like the way that they're being treated, giving them permission to do something about it.
And then another question that was asked is isolation normal for teenagers?
That is a great question. That is a really great question, because in some ways, yes, there is some isolation that happens when kids are teenagers. But I think, well, I guess maybe isolation, I don't like the term isolation. I think it's normal for teens to start spending some more time alone, and to start developing kind of their own sense of self, and in that they end up spending more time alone. But once it crosses the line into isolation, and so that's kind of like, where's the healthy, like, I need to recharge because I've spent a lot of time on school and extracurriculars and been with friends, and I just need some healthy alone time to be able to feel myself again. And when does it go to, I'm no longer engaging with other people, I'm no longer engaging with my friends, I'm not completing my responsibilities? And I think that is more what I consider isolation. So what does it look like when your teen is spending time alone? Is it really genuinely they're an introvert, or they've just spent a lot of time doing stuff and they need to rest and relax? Or is it every day they're coming home and locking themselves in the room for the rest of the day? That would be more isolation. So again, kind of looking at those behavior changes. Are their grades dropping? Do they seem more sad? Obviously, teens tend to be a little bit more irritable as they're going through hormonal changes, but there's still a level of, this kid does not look like my kid anymore. And that's definitely not normal. So it is normal for teens to spend a little bit more time alone than what they did when they were younger. But when it's happening every day for hours upon hours and they're no longer engaging with other people, that's when it's definitely a concern.
Hopefully, I've addressed all the questions. If you asked a question and you don't feel like the question was fully answered, feel free to ask again in the chat. But just a reminder that our counselors at all levels do age appropriate lessons regarding self-care and healthy relationships. And so if you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out to your child's campus counselor, and they can get that information to you. Some of them might have already happened. Some of them might be coming up throughout the school year. So you could just reach out to find that information. But then also just know that you can see what's coming up, because they should be posting that information ahead of time so that you can see what is being taught in those lessons by counselors, and that you're welcome to, get more information from your counselor anytime. So that looks like all of the questions. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thanks for Kelly for presenting, and we will get this information presentation posted on our website. In the counseling section of the Prosper ISD website, there is a parent education link, and that's where we post all of our presentations that we have. And then we'll also be sharing information about our upcoming spring presentations before we leave for break. We'll have our next one, the dates scheduled and ready to go, so that you can plan on joining for the next one. But thanks again, Kelly, for coming and joining us today. And thank you for everyone who joined. And if you have any questions that come up from here on out, feel free to reach out to your child's counselor, and they can hopefully get the answer or put you in touch with someone or a resource that can help you.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexis. I appreciate it.